Good morning. Thank you, Rob, for that introduction, and thank you all for being here this morning. I'm going to see if I can figure out how to function this. All right, so it is right there. Sorry, I didn't come up here ahead of time and check it out. All right, so I'm going to start with a very broad overview of the regulation of animal food, and then as I go through the process, I'll talk through the pathways that are available, the information that you would consider, and if you are looking to seek out a regulatory decision relative to substances for use in animal food. And at the end, we're going to hone in on that piece that's additional pieces that need to be considered relative to use of substances in fortifying human food. So we're going to start with a very easy question. What is animal food? Well, in the U.S., the regulatory definition is any food that is provided to an animal. So that's going to include your livestock, including your poultry feed. It's going to include companion animals, your cats and dogs. It's also going to cover those exotic animals that we often don't think about when we're preparing food and feed for animals. So here within the U.S., the Federal Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act is the basis that provides the law, how we regulate food and animal drugs here across the United States. Nested underneath of that is going to be the Code of Federal Regulations, or the CFR, and that's going to explain how you meet those requirements that are outlined in the law. Now, I do recognize I've already got my first acronym up here. I am from the government. We love our acronyms. I'm going to try to define all of those acronyms as we go, but hopefully don't inundate you with too much acronym soup here today. Within in the Food, Drug, and Cosmetic Act, there are 3 buckets in which we might find substances that can go into animal food. They're going to be categorized as an animal drug, as a food or a food additive, and as a color additive. And so I'm going to describe a little bit more what each of those buckets are and how we get there. So an animal drug, as defined in the Act, is an article that is intended to diagnose, cure, mitigate, treat, or prevent a disease in animal or man. It is also defined as a substance other than food that is going to affect the structure or function of that animal or of man. And so these definitions apply both to humans and animals, but when we're talking about animals, and specifically when we're talking about poultry, a lot of the drugs that we give to poultry are provided orally by either the feed or the water, and so we refer to those as medicated feed or medicated water. The next bucket, if you will, of substances that can go into animal food are going to be defined as either food or food additive. So a food is defined as a substance that provides taste, aroma, or nutritive value to the intended species. And that food additive is going to be an article that is not necessarily providing that taste, aroma, or nutritive value, but it is going to become either directly or indirectly a component of the animal food. Now this week, if you've had the opportunity to attend some of the symposia and other presentations, you've heard a lot about soybean meal. Soybean meal is a substance that is included into our poultry diets as a source of nutritive value, and so that would be considered a food. We've also heard a lot about enzymes, and those enzymes are intended to have a direct effect on the characteristics of animal food, and so they would fall into the food additive category. And one thing you might not think about, but that indirect component of animal food can be anything that comes into contact with that food. And so when we put that feed into a feed bag, it can become an indirect component of animal food and fall under that food additive category. Now the third category, the substances that can go into animal food, is that of a color additive. Oh, sorry, I got ahead of myself here. First I'm going to go to the GRAS substances, which are a subset of the food additive bucket. Here you can see what the definition of a generally recognized as safe substance is. I'm going to describe a little in a little bit more detail in a bit what the differences are between the food additive and the GRAS substance. But the law separates the GRAS substance as it excludes certain requirements, pre-market evaluation from the food additive piece for a GRAS substance. All right, so now I'm going to get to that third bucket, which is the color additive. And a color additive is simply defined as any substance that is intended to impart color, whether to the animal food or to the meat or other byproducts of the animal. So for example, eggs. So I gave you 3 buckets, and if it is the intended use that it is being marketed for is going to define or help to decide which bucket, whether it's an animal drug, animal food, or a color additive. That intended use that's to be marketed is going to help define which category that's going to fall under. Now, I do want to take just a moment to recognize that on the human side, we do have the Dietary Supplement Health and Education Act, also referred to as DSHEA. That allows an additional category for foods to go into and have supplements. So when you go to your local GNC and you see supplements on the shelves, the Act allows for that in the human realm. However, in animal food, DSHEA does not apply to animals, and so a lot of the intended uses that you see on those bottles when you go into GNC, unless they are a source, again, of taste, aroma, nutritive value, or they are intended to have some impact on the food, they're going to be considered animal drugs. So I'm going to walk through the pre-market pathways, very high level, that are available for seeking a regulatory decision from FDA on substances intended for animal food. As you see here, I've got the food additive regulation, the GRAS conclusion, and the AFCO ingredient definition, all of which are going to apply to those food and food additives. I'm also going to talk about the color additive regulation, which applies to color additives. I'm not going to talk about animal drugs because as I was preparing for this presentation, I considered that when we're looking at fortification of human food, it's less likely that you're going to go down that animal drug path as compared with going down the food path. I will note, though, that there are a lot of similarities between the types of information that need to be prepared, pulled together for both the drug and the food path. So if you have questions on that, I'd be happy to talk to you afterwards. So the first pathway that I'm going to talk about is the food additive regulation. This is an appropriate pathway for any substance intended to provide taste, aroma, nutritive value, or to have a direct impact on the characteristic of that animal food. Depending on the safety profile, some of the other pathways that I talk about may or may not be appropriate. But in all cases, a substance for a food would be appropriate to go through the food additive regulation. So for food additive regulation, in order for us, FDA is a reactive body. In order for us to make a decision on something, we need a firm, someone to come forward and provide us the data and information to opine on. And so one would do that by pulling together a number of different pieces for a complete dossier, scientific dossier, and I'll talk about those pieces here in a little bit. But once that complete packet is pulled together and it's submitted to FDA, as Rob mentioned earlier, we'll go through and we will evaluate that information, and then it is very likely we're going to have questions. We're going to go through, we're going to identify the data gaps that we have questions on relative to being able to make a regulatory decision. Now, I will note that some of the questions that we ask on the academic side are not always the same questions that we ask for on the regulatory side, and so sometimes our questions are kind of looking to bridge the gap between those two sets of information. So once FDA goes through and evaluates that submission and we interact back and forth with the firm asking our questions, and we finally get to a point where all the data gaps have been filled and FDA is ready to get to a favorable decision, we are going to send an approval letter out to that firm, letting them know that their substance is acceptable. It's considered reasonably safe and effective for its intended use. We are also at the same time going to send something forward to our Federal Register. So that's the federal newspaper for the government. And that's going to announce to the world, to anybody that reads it, that we have a new regulation approved for use in animal food. And along with that, we're also going to publish in the CFR the new food additive regulation. What's it intended for, the specifications around it, et cetera. All right, so as I mentioned earlier, that GRAS conclusion, that GRAS pathway is going to be a subset of the food additives. There are a lot of similarities between the GRAS and the food additive because it is, in fact, a food additive, but there are also differences. Some of the differences are the fact that GRAS notices, unlike food additive petitions, do not require pre-market approval by the FDA before they can enter into interstate commerce. The other piece of that is that a firm that is making a GRAS conclusion is not required to notify FDA of their GRAS conclusion. That said, a lot of firms will notify FDA of their GRAS conclusion. And one of the reasons, there may be a number of reasons why a firm chooses to do that. I think that one of the reasons possibly is that, here in the United States, we have 50 different states, all governed by their own laws and regulations. And usually a letter coming from FDA saying that, hey, they have no questions, this is a reasonably safe and effective substance, will be accepted by the 50 states. And so rather than having to go to each of those states individually, we kind of are able to, it's a little bit of a smoother path. So as I mentioned, even though a firm does not need to go through the pre-market approval pathway, they're not required to for GRAS, there are, again, similarities between that and the food additive pathway. For example, the same quality and quantity of information that is included into a GRAS notice or a GRAS conclusion dossier should be the same type of information that is provided if you were seeking out FDA approval through a food additive pathway. The additional caveat that goes along with that is that it must be publicly available. That information that's used to make the safety conclusion, at least, must be publicly available. And part of the reason for that is the FDA considers the general recognition of safety component to be met if there is a reasonable certainty in the minds of competent scientists that the substance is not harmful for its intended use. So in order for those competent scientists to be able to make that determination that it is reasonably safe, they have to have access to the information. And so that's where the public piece of it comes, the publicly available piece of it comes into play. Now, the majority of the information that we see in GRAS conclusions is coming from that peer-reviewed literature. And that's, gives the scientists the opportunity to see the information, opine on it, agree with, disagree, wherever they're going to fall out. So much like the food additive route, if a firm chooses to notify CVM or FDA, we will evaluate it. One of the other differences is that because a GRAS conclusion is intended to have all of the information inside of that initial packet to support the safety, if we have questions on it, instead of leading to kind of that iterative process that you see in some of the other pathways, we will send a questions letter that outlines our questions. And when the firm, if they elect to come back in and seek that favorable decision, we basically start all over, brand new packet, brand new set of review, et cetera. And the only other thing I'll throw out there on the GRAS conclusion piece is that for this one, CVM FDA is not the one making the conclusion. We are just, it is the person that pulls together the dossier that has made the conclusion. We are just going through the information provided in that dossier, and as competent scientists, determining whether or not we agree, we have questions on how they got to that conclusion or not. So the third pathway that's available for those substances that provide taste, aroma, nutritive value, or affect the characteristics of the food is going to be the AFCO ingredient definition pathway. This is very similar in terms of processes to that of a food additive petition. The type of information that's provided is very similar. The difference is the AFCO is not a federal regulatory pathway. Instead, it is facilitated by the Association of Animal Feed Control Officials, or AFCO. And we, FDA, collaborate with AFCO under a memorandum of understanding, providing the scientific and technical expertise to evaluate that scientific data that's submitted to the AFCO in support of a new ingredient definition. Like the food additive petition pathway, it's an iterative process. We'll back and forth, ask our questions, and once we get to that point of a favorable decision, we will notify the firm via letter and a recommendation to both the firm as well as to AFCO, recommending that the information is satisfactory to support the AFCO ingredient definition, and that AFCO publish it in their official publication. Yep. Okay, so the color additive regulation is going to be, again, very similar to the food additive petition pathway. The difference being that they are defined separately in the Act, and so they are two separate pathways. As a reminder, a color additive is intended to impart color either to the animal food or to the meat or byproducts of that animal. They can be sourced from natural or synthetic sources, but regardless of where it is sourced for, if its intended use is to impart color to something, then it must go through pre-market evaluation and approval before it can be entered into interstate commerce. Much like the food additive pathway, upon conclusion, a favorable conclusion by the FDA, that substance will be announced in the Federal Register and placed into the Code of Federal Regulations as an approved color additive. All right, next thing I'm going to talk to you about is that dossier that I mentioned. It's very similar across all of the approval pathways, the type of information that needs to go in there. Hopefully when the slides are up, it'll give you kind of a overview, high level of the buckets that are needed to be addressed, but in the meantime, I'll at least talk through them for you. So for each of those pathways, you're going to need to address the intended use. And that intended use is composed of 3 pieces. First is that physical, nutritional, or technical effect. Why are we including that substance into the feed? Why are we feeding that to the animal? What do we want to get out of it? The second piece is going to be the inclusion amount. How much of that substance do we need to feed to the animal in order for it to elicit the intended effect? And the third piece is the animal itself. What are we targeting? Are we targeting, if we're talking poultry, are we targeting just targeting just broiler chickens? Are we targeting all chickens? Are we targeting all poultry species? So all of those 3 pieces go into what makes up the intended use. Then from a scientific data perspective, we need information on utility. That utility is the type of data and information that's going to show us how to confirm that the intended use, when you feed this substance, it actually occurs, right? So it is establishing the intended use. The type of data and information for utility is going to depend on the substance itself. For example, if we're doing a macronutrient, if we go back to soybean meal, my example earlier, we see a lot of feed 'em and weigh 'em studies for that. As compared with a conventional protein source, are we seeing same as, if not better, weight gain, feed efficiency? We're not seeing any negative effects in those birds. The second, or the next technical section, if you will, is that of target animal safety. And so in that, we want to, at the end of the day, we want the substance to be useful, yes, but we also want it to be safe for the target animal that we're feeding it to. And so, again, depending on the safety profile for that substance, we'll determine what kind of data and information needs to be submitted. But generally speaking, we want to see that either there is a low risk of safety, and if there are safety risks, how are we mitigating those risks before it's fed to the animal, or to avoid adverse events in the animal. Now we're talking about poultry here and fortification of human food. So human food safety is going to be another component that needs to be addressed. Under human food safety, you're looking at the metabolites and the residues that may be left behind in that animal as a result of feeding the substance. You're also thinking about tolerances for the humans, average daily intakes, that sort of thing, and so all of that plays a role in it. Depending on the pathway that you go, there's also an environmental assessment that needs to be addressed. And depending on what the substance is, how it's being used, will determine how in-depth that environmental assessment needs to be addressed within the dossier. There's also the chemistry and manufacturing section, and that's going to include, I've got down here 5 different key components. The first is the identity and composition. We want to know about the substance that you're feeding. The analytical method validation. How are you, what analytical methods are you using, and those analytical methods, oh my gosh, need to be validated, both for analyzing the substance in the feed, as well as when we're talking human food safety, being able to analyze for those residues and metabolites in the meat. or eggs. We also want to know about specifications. Now, for any of these substances that are going down the food, that are considered a food additive, or a color additive, once they are approved, they are not proprietary. And so the next manufacturer that comes along with a product that they are able to meet that specifications, like the target animal safety and all of the decision is based on the particular, the substance that came through first. And so we want those products that come through in the next rounds to be able to meet those same expectations, those same specifications, such that we have confidence that the substance that comes in second and third is equally safe and effective. We also want information under the chemistry and manufacturing section relative to stability and mixability. We want that product, once it's on the shelf, to be stable for whatever amount of time that its stability data is suggested to support, because we want it to be as effective on day one as it is, for example, 18 months later. And then mixability, again, we're feeding these substances for poultry in either animal or drugs, in feed or perfect, thank you. So we're putting these substances into animal feed and water. And so we want to make sure that that substance is homogeneously applied across the feeds so that each animal is getting its intended amount. We're also going to look at labeling. And again, these substances are not considered proprietary, and so we don't need that final printed label that's going to go on the bag that's being sold out in commerce. But we do like to see a mock label. There are federal requirements for labeling components. AFCO also has additional recommendations under their model regulations that a lot of the states look at and consider and have, in some cases, adopted into their own state laws. And so we look to make sure both the federal requirements and then the AFCO regulations being met, because that helps to move things along when you're ready to put it out into commerce. And specifically for the food additive petition or for the AFCO ingredient definition, we're also going to look at, have the firm provide us with a proposed draft regulation or ingredient definition. Now, as I mentioned earlier, at the end, when we get to that favorable decision, we're going to publish something either through the CFR for the food additive regulation, or AFCO hopefully is going to publish that definition. And so this is our starting point. And as FDA goes through and evaluates that data and information, we may make edits to the proposal before it goes out, but the firm helps to get us started with that. All right. So now I'm going to get into kind of some additional things to think about if you're planning to fortify animal products. So we already talked about all the different technical sections that need to go in to be taken into consideration when we're talking about a substance intended for animal food, and those are going to continue to apply. With substances that are intended to fortify an animal product, there are a couple of additional things to consider as well. So for those products, the dossier should also outline the intended use amounts for the animal diet that is necessary to successfully fortify that human food product. As part of that, you're going to also address what the impactful change in the human food product means. Now, sometimes it may be that it's a statistical difference, and that's easy enough to explain, but sometimes those statistical differences can be so small that yes, it is different, but it's not biologically relevant to the human. And so being able to describe in your dossier whether, how are you determining that it's having that impactful change to the human. And all of this information, while it's not going to necessarily, it will in some ways impact the intended use, it also helps to support, once you get to the other side, to that favorable approval from FDA for use of this substance in animal food. One of the things that most companies that are marketing the human food are then going to be interested in doing is making claims on those food packages to say, that whatever the substance is fortifying. And so by providing this information and explanation to us, it helps FDA as a whole, because we do collaborate with our sister center, the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition, who covers the human food side of things. collectively, or collaboratively rather, the information will help to support that those future marketing claims are not false or misleading. All right. Now, there are some additional things if you are looking at specific substances or to fortify specific substances. For example, we know that on the human food side of things, that there is an average daily intake limitation set for EPA and DHA. And so if you are looking at a substance, for example, that is intended to fortify those fatty acids in human food, then that's something that would, as in early discussions, may impact the regulatory pathway that you choose to take. Because of that ADI that is set for human food, it's considered a safety concern. And so that typically we would recommend that it go through a food additive regulation, as opposed to the AFCO pathway or the GRAS notification process. Now, I say typically. It is possible to go through the GRAS notification process, but if you'll remember earlier, I mentioned that one of the requirements of the GRAS is that that information be publicly available for the safety aspect. And the difficulty with something like this is that usually when you're going through the GRAS process, you want a compound. It may not just be the specific compound you're looking at, specific substance you're looking at. There may be similar substances that are close enough to, and you can make that argument about how there are similarities and where the differences are. With substances intended to be a source of DHA and EPA, because of that ADI, we know that the substances that often provide those, manufacturing can impact the final product, which impacts that same as aspect. And so a lot of times for the products, substances that are intended to support, to fortify these types of fatty acids, it may be that in the literature, you're gonna have to use only the substance that you're intending to market, or the alternative being to go through the food additive petition pathway, because we can then, FDA can make its conclusions based on information, whether it's publicly available or proprietary. The other thing to consider for certain substances is, especially if the animal has a nutrient requirement for it and we are looking to potentially fortify the substance in the human food beyond that animal's nutrient requirement, is where is that safety? How does that impact the animal? We don't want to fortify the animal product at the expense of the animal's safety. And so selenium, as we heard earlier, it depending on where the amounts that's included, can be one of those substances that falls into that category. All right. The other thing, once you're kind of post-approval for the substance's use in animal food, and if you are looking to put fortification claims onto that human food packaging, those claims need to be in alignment with the requirements for conventional food. I've got up here on the slide a couple of acts within the larger Food Federal Drug and Cosmetic Act that describe kind of the requirements, delineate which claims need, or what types of claims you can make on human food, which ones require pre-market evaluation, which ones don't. In the abstract for this session, there is a website to a link listed in there that gives you a lot more information on the different types of claims on these acts. It's just something to be aware of, because some claims don't require any pre-market evaluation. You can go straight to market, while others will require them. All right, so I've got just 2 slides left to wrap up here. I talked very high level about the different pathways that are available for substances intended for animal food, including those that are intended to be fed to animals with the intent of fortifying human food. Depending on which pathway you choose, your starting place will be different. Now, in all cases, CVM is happy to talk about any of these things in pre-consultation meetings before actually submitting a dossier. We can talk about what regulatory pathway or pathways might make the most sense, the type of studies and information that need to be submitted, et cetera. But when you're at the point of submitting that dossier, if it's for a GRAS notice or if it's for a food additive petition, it's going to come straight to CVM. If it is for an AFCO feed ingredient definition, it's going to start with the AFCO investigator, and then they will consult to us to evaluate that scientific data and information. And if it's for a color additive petition, or if it's discussing the claims specifically that are intended to be put on that human food packaging, then you'll first start with the Center for Food Safety and Applied Nutrition. And I'm going to wrap this up with just a reminder, a recognition rather, that I have gone through a lot of regulatory pathways, a lot of regulatory information in a relatively short period of time. There's a lot more to it. We do have guidances for industry on our website. You can Google any one of you put guidance for industry 262 in Google, it will pop right up and give you a lovely PDF that you can read through with a lot more details. I will note that we do have we have that pre-submission consultation process. We are happy to come and talk with firms that are interested in potentially pursuing a regulatory decision in the future. We also, for studies that are intended to potentially support a regulatory decision in the future, we do protocol reviews. As I mentioned, the questions that are asked for the academic type questions are sometimes different than those that are the questions that are asked for a regulatory decision. And so we're happy to kind of look at the protocols and look at it through that lens of how might this study support a regulatory decision. And the final thing I'm going to point out here on this slide is that email address at the bottom of the slide, the animal food pre-market address. Any questions that you have, if you're interested in doing a pre-submission consultation, you just have general questions about what's in these GFIs, anything else I've talked about today, and maybe things I haven't talked about. If it's related to animal food, if you send it to that inbox, the wonderful people that man that inbox will make sure it gets to the right person, and we will get you an answer. And so with that, I want to thank you all for your time and attention this morning, and I will be happy to answer any questions during the panel discussion this afternoon.